well. It's always nice for us to know where the audience comes from. We're going to keep the chat closed, I think, for this meeting. There is lots of speakers, and we have been sent in lots of questions already. So let's get going. Is that okay? Yeah, we're ready to set off. Brilliant. Welcome to this important meeting. Cuba resists, Trump, the blockade, and the US elections. It is 4 days before the actual US elections, and to date, the blockade of Cuba is the longest in history and has been punitively tightened during the Trump administration. In fact, since the COVID-19 pandemic, the Trump administration has introduced another 43 additional measures against Cuba, which are in addition to the 200 measures to tighten the US blockade of Cuba since the beginning of Trump's presidency. And that is a problem for all of us, because the world needs Cuba. And that is why we have organized this meeting tonight. We are delighted to have such excellent speakers, but before I pass over to them, I wanted to share a few words about Rock Around the Blockade, who have organized this event. Rock Around the Blockade were formed in 1995 by members and supporters of the Revolutionary Communist Group. We linked up with the UJC, the Union of Young Communists. Since then, we have sent 13 brigades to Cuba, providing material aid to Cuban youth. This includes sound systems for recreational centers, mobile sound systems that take music up to the mountains and into rural areas, ballet shoes and boxing gloves, and medical material aid. In Britain, we have organised protests, educational meetings, film showings, and live music events. We provide a voice for Cuba through our website, events, and actions. We constantly campaigned for the freedom of the Cuban Five through their imprisonment and celebrated their final release in December 2014. In February, March 2008, we organised a speaking tour across Britain with 3 Cuban revolutionaries, including Orlando Borrego, a comrade of Che Guevara. In 2019, we celebrated the 60th anniversary of the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. Rock Around the Blockade sent our 14th Solidarity Brigade to the island. Young activists from Britain spent 2 weeks meeting Cubans from all walks of life, visiting schools, hospitals, factories, community centers, farms, learning about Cuban socialism, and holding exchanges with Cuban youth about the reality of living under capitalism in Britain. Cuba shows that there is an alternative to racism, exploitation, and war. Cuban socialism is an alternative to capitalism. We use this example to support working class struggles here in Britain. Cuba illustrates international solidarity. Cuba shows that socialism is the only system that can provide for the mass of humanity. In fact, Miguel Díaz-Canel, President of the Republic of Cuba, pointed out just this Wednesday gone by at the closing of the National Assembly of People's Power that COVID-19 has illustrated to the world the advantages of a planned economy and the humanism of the socialist system. He stressed that the pandemic has provoked a confrontation of political systems in which the social and humanist perspective of the Cuban Revolution is triumphing. Canal concluded that a small country resists the attacks of its adversary and that it grows by creating, innovating can only be explained by the human orientation of a project, the political will of the Communist Party and the government, and the extraordinary strength of a people who are experts in resisting and winning. That is Cuba today. These are significant times. This meeting is so important. So on that note, I will pass on to Jose Cabañas, the Cuban ambassador of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good evening in London, good afternoon here in Washington. Thank you for organizing this. We appreciate your permanent support and friendship and your long-lasting relationship with Cuban counterparts. For us, it's a pleasure to have been invited to make a presentation and also to chair this panel with Ambassador Montalvo, Professor Jaffe, and Dr. Balia Rodriguez. I think our friend Gloria Larria was invited, but I don't know if she will be attending. We have some slides for our presentation. I would like to reemphasize on something that you just said, Susie, which is the blockade is 60 years old, almost 60 years old. It's the longest and oldest economic war in history against any country. And the purpose is basically to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. You can talk about arguments, you can talk about the reasons to support that, but the fact is that the main purpose has been to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. And 60 years later, we have to say it's a failure. This panel is called Cuba Resists, but Cuba not only resists, Cuba moves forward and share what it has with everyone all around the world. We were invited to provide a little bit of historical perspective. We have to mention, I have two hats. I'm a diplomat, I'm a professor as well. Then I will be more than pleased to make a few comments in that historical perspective, and probably to react to questions and comments that your member have. First, we have to remember that Fidel Castro came to Washington, D.C. in April 1959. We are talking about some facts that happened before many of us were born, many years ago. And then Fidel came at that time to explain to the American people, the Cuban and American authorities, why the Cuban Revolution took place. And it's very well known. He was supposed to meet the President Eisenhower. He was welcomed by President Nixon. And by the end of the meeting, when the Vice President Nixon wrote his report, he said something like, at some point we have to get rid of this guy. I mean, the chances for the Cuban Revolution were expressed at that time. And only a year later, in April 1960, it was written what is called in history Mallory Memorandum. Lester Mallory was a bureaucrat at the State Department at the time, responsible, the second person in Western Hemisphere Division. And this is the first slide we have in our presentation, because it's important to understand how soon the fate, in American terms, the fate of the Cuban Revolution was written. And if you read the first, second, and sixth lines, Mallory said at the time, the majority of Cubans support Castro, which is, Cubans still support the Cuban Revolution 60 years later. There is no effective political opposition. It's like saying that they had to create one. And on the sixth sentence, it says, the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through the disenchantment and disaffection based on economic disaffection and hardship. The blockade was not still in place. The nationalization process in Cuba took place starting basically August that year. Then it was well before Bay of Pigs, well before the missile crisis. And Mallory keeps saying, if the above are accepted or cannot be successfully countered, it follows that possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba, denying money and supplies to Cuba, decrease monetary and real wages to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. I mean, it's completely transparent. Those ideas, and we have to mention that the blockade, what some people call in the United States embargo, but it's a blockade, is the core element of U.S. state policy towards Cuba. It's not that one president or the next one will change this regulation or the other. I mean, this is a state policy that has been respected for all successive administrations for many years. Then it's important to understand that what we call the U.S. blockade against Cuba is based on several regulations and pieces of legislation. And then the next slide, the present slides show and mention Trading with the Enemy Act 1917, Foreign Assistance Act 1961, and the Proclamation 3447 signed by President Kennedy in 1962. And let me read with you the first paragraph of that proclamation, because it's very enlightening. You know, it says, whereas the 8th meeting of consultation of ministers of foreign affairs serving as organ of consultation and application of the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance in this final act resolved that the present government of Cuba is incompatible with the principle and objective of the Inter-American System, OAS, basically. And when we mentioned that, remember, years later in 2009, all rights of Cuba were reinstated on the OAS, and it was upon our decision to be member of NAM. But at that time, a decision taken by OAS was mentioned. And it continues by saying, and in light of the subversive offensive of Sino-Soviet communism, with which the government of Cuba is publicly aligned, urge the member states to take those steps, and they may consider appropriate for their individual and collective self-defense. Then our relationship with China was an issue. Our relationship with the Soviet Union was an issue. The Soviet Union doesn't exist as a country anymore, and United States is the largest economic partner of China. But still, Cuba was punished because of that kind of relationship. And the next slide is simply the New York Times informing about the total embargo on Cuba, on Cuban imports. The next slide, we have one of the several of the most important laws and regulations. I will simply comment on a few of them. Next slide, please. First, the Cuban assets control. Just to give you an idea on how many regulations, how many pieces of legislation are related, and they have to be. It is simply to lift the embargo on Cuba. The Cuban asset control regulations of the Department of Treasury, the so-called CACRs, and you see every time a new action, a new sanction is introduced against Cuba, then Treasury publish afterwards amendments to those regulations, the so-called CACRs. Export Administration Act 1979, Export Administration Regulation 1979, and then we have the so-called Cuban Democracy Act, of publicly known as Torricelli Act. These two pieces of legislation, 92 and 96, were passed immediately after the crisis created in Cuba by the disappearance of the socialist bloc, the Soviet Union first, and then the socialist bloc back in 1990. Cuban enemies in the United States at that time, they failed. They had the chance finally to overthrow the Cuban revolution. And Torricelli Act was more addressed to cut ties of companies in third countries with Cuba. I mean, American companies that have a subsidiary in a third country, then to cut those ties. And then the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, or the so-called also Helms-Burton Act, was passed in 1996. For those of you that never read, I mean, it's a difficult piece of legislation to read. The Helms-Burton Act first is unconstitutional, and I can tell you quite frankly, most of the people that voted and passed the resolution in Congress, they never read the legislation. It was approved almost overnight, early February 1996, late February 1996. But if you have the chance to go through it and read it, the conclusion is Cuba, simply by surrendering to the United States, will get a different treatment, a different policy from Washington. It's the only option. I mean, it's not about, at that time was used the argument of compensation after Cuban nationalization. But if you go through the legislation, the only option for the Cuban people is to surrender and become like a colony of United States. Then after 1996, the so-called Section 211 of the Emergency Supplemental Appropriation Act was passed to limit the registration of Cuban brands in United States. And quite frankly, for those of you who study the United States, or they have some confidence in the United States legal system, I can tell you that that section was added in handwriting to the draft of the act, and it was never discussed on the floor in Congress. I mean, if you look into the congressional record and you try to find any debate, who supported that, who introduced Section 211, there is nothing, blank. I mean, it was, by the end, it was added outside a conference committee, was added to the legislation, but it is in force these days in the United States. And finally, you have the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act, the year 2000, when after the tremendous push by the agricultural lobby in the United States, finally it was allowed to sell food to Cuba under specific regulations, very limited, but at the same time, that legislation added more limits in travel to Cuba, in what they consider tourism to Cuba, and simply forbidding that option. Among the, I go back to the point of Susie mentioned that during the last 4 years, on top of these regulations, 225 new sanctions has been implemented against Cuba in 4 years. 121 in the last 2 years. I mean, 2019 and 2020, the embargo has been reinforced. And among those, probably the ones that are listed here are not the most relevant, but they are important. It's the next slide, please. Among those actions taken in the last years, you have the lifting of the waiver on Title III of the Helms-Burton legislation that provides the possibility of establishing lawsuits against Cuban companies investing in foreign companies investing in Cuba. I mean, US companies and countries from all over the world. As you know, this title from the legislation had a waiver. It was never implemented until recently. This title specifically was supposed to limit, to freeze foreign investment in Cuba, but now it's interesting the way it has acted as a boomerang against American interests, because so far those claimants, I mean the indictments you have under the legislation are basically against American companies rather than foreign companies, although it's still a limit for the continuity of foreign investment in Cuba. This year, we have had the ban on flights from United States to all Cuban provinces except Havana, limiting family exchange and limiting travel to Cuba. Let me tell you that in the last 5 to 6 years, we have welcomed more than 5 million Americans. I mean, until this limit, we welcome more than 5 million Americans and Cuban Americans visiting Cuba, coming back and forth. Then this ban came precisely to limit that exchange and to limit income in Cuba, of course. We have had increased persecution of Cuban financial and commercial transactions these years, and the persecution and intimidation of companies that send fuel supplies to Cuba. 5 different packages of measures to monitor them has been implemented, and we could continue going on and on. Let me mention at least 2, and this is the next slide, of measures that have affected specifically the United Kingdom. In one case, the next slide, please. In one case is the sanction against the Standard Chartered Bank, a British-based entity in the banking financial sector. This bank had to pay that many dollars to the American government for a violation of the regulations called CACR. And the second one is related to the phone traffic. We cannot do it directly with American counterparts, and we have to move through different nodes all over the world, including United Kingdom. In that case, it's probably a benefit for the British companies. Let me finish by saying that although this is, I mean, the blockade against Cuba is like a Frankenstein. I mean, you have too many pieces being part of that monster. Don't feel that there is a unanimous support or anything like that to that policy in the United States. Many people have questioned that policy, and we have had several attempts to kill, or at least to vacuum the legislation. In the next slide, we have just a few attempts through different draft legislation that has been put forward in Congress to get rid of the blockade. I can tell you, frankly, I have been here for 8 years now. I'm coming to an end of my duties in Washington by next December. We have had the chance to travel in this country to many states and cities, and it's minimal, the support for this policy. Most people in the United States, they feel this is a failed policy, that the authorities should try a different path and should normalize a relationship with Cuba. And all of us, we wonder, well, if democracy works, how is that the government is not representing the will of the majority of people? But I have witnessed that sentiment in many cities and different states in this country. And let me leave you with the final idea, because 2020 has been a special year for everybody all over the world. And this final idea is that if the US blockade against Cuba has been an act of war for the last 60 years under COVID, to reinforce the blockade against Cuba is a crime and it's an act of genocide. I will leave it here, and I'm completely open to react and to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely detailed overview of the longest, harshest US blockade of Cuba. And every time we hear these facts, it's absolutely shocking that it is, as you said, being allowed to go on against what the majority of people in the world actually believe. And I'm going to just want to say thank you in the room to the people who have joined. We have people here from the Party of Socialism and Liberation, Papa Militant International, Cubans in the UK, the Green Party, Socialist Party of the US. Welcome to the meeting. I'm going to next ask Flora Riva to speak. I hope that she is there and her mic is on.
Thank you so much. Well, I have only used Zoom about 300 times. You think I know how to get through it. I'm sorry. It's so wonderful to be with you all, and I wish to give greetings to the sister chairing. I didn't get your name because I started late. To ambassadors, Jose Ramon Cabañas, I'm glad you're still our ambassador in the US, and to Barbara Montalvo, ambassador to the UK, as well as to the doctor, and to Helen Yaffe. Thank you for making this happen, Helen. And to Valia Rodriguez, Dr. Valia Rodriguez. We are facing unprecedented times in the world, and certainly in the US with the crisis of COVID. I think a new lexicon has to be created to describe the level of what we are experiencing in the US with, frankly, not just because of the capitalist system, but because of President Trump, who has mocked the people, laughed while he got the best care possible, continues to defy scientific information, and really lead people to their death. And I think that the world, and certainly the people of the US, are starting to wake up to the real crime of the system that we're living in what was always touted as the richest country in the world, the most developed, the most democratic, that people are dying in far larger numbers than anywhere else. 227,000 people now, and almost 9 million who become ill. But certainly it is a crisis everywhere. We still do not have any national approach to this crisis, none at all. And I will say a little bit about the election because I know the world is watching. The world is watching. But I wish to salute warmly the Cuban people and the government, the doctors and nurses who expose themselves to great risk every day. Really, nurses and doctors everywhere, but a special thanks to the doctors and to the Henry Reeve Internationalist Brigade and to all who are working worldwide to see that these altruistic comrades, the courageous Cubans, get the honor and the recognition that they so deserve. And in the midst of this, in addition to the crimes of the US government of, against its own people, that most cynical, inhumane attempt added to everything Ambassador Cabañas just listed, this incredible list of blockade measures, this attempt by the US to demonize doctors of Cuba, to try to force other countries to reject them. In addition to another program that people may not know about in the US, a very cynical move a number of years ago called the Cuban Medical Professional Parole Act, in which any Cuban doctor serving internationally in the world can approach a US embassy or a consulate and request to defect to the United States. And only by doing that, by denouncing their own government, will they be able to fly into the US and get sped tracked for medical acceptance to practice in the United States. That's another form of bribery and brain drain, much like the 1966 Cuban Adjustment Act that favors Cuban immigrants. And but I wish to say that it's really shocking, these 121 measures in 2 years, and I hope that we can have a listing from Cuba, and we can help to translate it if it's there, for people to know about. I think the biggest challenge for us is that people are not aware of the extent of the US blockade. They hear the word embargo, but even there, they don't know the extent of the US measures and how absolutely cruel it is. I know we have led many delegations lately as Rock Around the Blockade. And I think it's really important. There's nothing like going to Cuba. Not everybody can go, but when people go and they hear from the Cubans, even I've taken people who've had somewhat cynical ideas or didn't understand the process, they're deeply affected. You can't help but be affected if you're a human being. I know how necessary it is for people to have a life of dignity and to be able to basically survive, and then to hear from the Cubans. I want to say something about the elections because it's really looming on all of us. Everyone is watching here in the US, the polls, the attempt by the Trump administration to intervene with the naming of this new judge, an extremely right-wing reactionary judge who will absolutely tip the balance to a solid reactionary vote on many questions, on women's right to choose, on the Affordable Care Act, which, although it's limited, it did provide some progress for people. That is bound to be overturned. Many, many other measures. It is a right-wing Supreme Court of a dictatorial court, which is, it has always been that way. But anyway, the reason for Trump doing this is because he wants very much to assure that he will win. He has stated several times that if he loses, that it is fraud. And so there's a danger of him trying to intervene in different ways. The Supreme Court did make 2 rulings in the last 2 days to allow the states of Pennsylvania and Ohio to continue to, and North Carolina, to accept the ballots that were mailed in beyond a 3-day deadline, because he sabotaged the post office, ordered this postmaster general who had no history in the post office to basically dismantle the sorting machines of the post offices so that it would delay by days and weeks the US mail. All these measures are intended for him to try to stay in power. And the really serious part of this is that the Democratic Party is not putting up a real fight. They're hoping that by Trump looking so bad and his horrendous treatment of the people during COVID and his flagrant attitude after he came out of the virus, that they're hoping that revulsion of Trump will drop votes to Biden. It's a very, very, very close call. We don't know what's going to happen. The issue is that we don't think that there is much difference between the parties. Of course, Trump is unimaginably reactionary, supporting the fascists, supporting the white supremacists, and all that he has done against the environment, against Cuba. He has loaded up so many measures. It's hard to imagine what else he could do. But it's certainly for the vote in Florida, which is so key. And it's still today, as of today, almost a tie. But I want to say something about the US system, because from Democrat to Republican to Republican to Democrat to Republican, every president has led the way to a further tightening against Cuba. And I think one critical time was when Clinton, as president, in actually March 16, 1996, he signed the Helms-Burton Law. And it was on a false premise. It was a couple of weeks after the shoot down by Cuba of invading planes, which had continued to invade. And Clinton had promised the Cuban government that the planes by these terrorists, the Brothers to the Rescue, would not be allowed to take off. In fact, they took off. That was on the United States. And yet Cuba has suffered all this time by the signing of the Helms-Burton Law, which he used as a pretext. But in that law, up until that time, the president had the prerogative as the executive to lift almost entirely the US blockade in different measures. And what Clinton did with the Helms-Burton Law was to hand it over to Congress. It is now Congress's prerogative to lift the economic, commercial, financial blockade. How do you do that with 535 congresspeople in different districts who look to an anti-Cuba vote for their money, for their contributions, for their careerism? That certainly is the case in Florida. It was the case of Robert Menendez in New Jersey, and also of Torricelli, of New Jersey, who signed and sponsored the Torricelli Law of 1992. But I want to get to something more modern, and that was Barack Obama. Barack Obama certainly worked with President Raul Castro to reinstate the diplomatic relations, which was a very important development after 55 years. And certainly there was hope, the lightening, the permission of Cubans to come to Cuba unlimited to visit their families, and also the group and individual travel that Obama allowed for. This was important. It helped Cuba, I think, economically, and also for people to see and visit Cuba without fear of reprisal from the US. But he did say something. It's important to know what Obama did that helped to unravel much of the leftist governments in Latin America that has had a direct effect on Cuba and Venezuela. We say that the tactics between the two wings, the Democrats and Republicans, may differ, but their objective is the same. That is, trying to overthrow the Cuban Revolution and any other progressive government. In May 23rd, 2008, in Obama's first presidential run, he gave his Latin America speech. He gave it on May 23rd in Miami, surrounded by people from the Cuban American National Foundation, known terrorists. And he gave a speech in which he basically said that George Bush had ignored Latin America, and in ignoring Latin America, had allowed basically the left to gain. He said, no, I'm quoting from Obama, he said, no wonder then that demagogues like Hugo Chavez have stepped into this vacuum. His predictable yet perilous mix of anti-American rhetoric, authoritarian government, and checkbook diplomacy offers the same false promise as the tried and failed ideologies of the past. And so he said, but the US is so alienated from the rest of the Americas that this state vision has gone unchallenged and has even made inroads from Bolivia to Nicaragua. What had happened in Nicaragua and Bolivia? This is 2008 Obama's speech as he's about to become president. In 2006, Evo Morales became president of Bolivia. In 2007, Daniel Ortega became president. Correa became president in 2007 for Ecuador. And Zelaya, I think the biggest warning to us was that Mel Zelaya became president in 2008 of Honduras, and he joined the ALBA alliance, which was unexpected by the US, and he promised that there could be an unbinding referendum on the question of a possible constitutional reform, which the people had been demanding in these countries and gained after the example of Venezuela and the resistance of Cuba. So in the first 6 months of Obama's term, Mel Zelaya was overthrown. And this began, I think, the unraveling, the weakening of the left, in addition to the aggression against Dilma and other leaders, against Correa, certainly, the coup against Morales. And it's so wonderful that last Sunday, the people rejected the repression, the coup, the fascist coup, and elected the leader of the MAS party. This is an example that the US cannot win. It ultimately cannot win. But I want to say all this, excuse me for the time I took for it, but people, many people in the US, even progressives, get caught up in the idea that this time, the Democrats will be different. And it's certainly understandable why people want to reject Trump, why people want to see him booted out and basically in prison. The man belongs in prison for everything that he has done. Put children in jail, put their parents in jail, and 545 parents cannot find they cannot be found for their kids to be reunited with them. Cuba, all of us who have worked on Cuba, all those who have traveled to Cuba, we feel very deeply for what you are going through. We must deepen our solidarity. I think there's been great measures in the US of activists in different cities passing resolutions calling for Cuban US medical cooperation, for the lifting of the blockade in the different, maybe they'll say embargo, but still measures. I have spoken to many people, I'm running for president, and in many audiences I've spoken to, over the years, I always ask people, how many of you have gone? Maybe a handful. How many of you want to go? Almost everybody wants to go to Cuba because they may not get all the truth about Cuba, but they know something's happening there. They know, they've heard good things, and people are starting to say, we have it so bad here, we have to look abroad. And in the United States, many youth are joining the socialist movement. This is a very, very big thing forward. I think Bernie Sanders helped to lift the fog of anti-communism for the last 2 runs that he made. People are disillusioned, and they're saying, well, what about socialism? I can tell you, sisters and brothers, I've been all around this country to 35 cities in the last 2 months, and it's shocking what people are going through. Some people look, you know, people around the world, maybe it's much more difficult in many countries, but there's no reason for people to be dying the way they have, for people to be in the street by at least 1 million people in the street in a cold winter where they will die this winter. One more fact before I end. In Los Angeles, as of December last year, the whole year last year, 960 people who were homeless died in the streets of Los Angeles County. 960. And this year, at the end of September, with 3 months left to go, 960 people died. So there's 3 months left to set a record. Cuba has been able to resist, has developed in astounding ways through the human intelligence, through the solidarity of the people, through its altruism, and we will always stand by you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you to the Party of Socialism and Liberation for the hard work that you're doing. Good luck in the next few days. What I think I've taken away is that we have so much political work to do, and that political work has to be taken out onto the streets. And, you know, Cuba is a beacon of hope for the poor and oppressed around the world, and that is what is so important. I'm going to pass on now to Valia Rodriguez, Cuban physician and member of the Cubans in the UK. Thank you, Valia. I hope your slides are here. Perfect.
Thank you to Rock Around the Blockade for the invitation, but especially thank you for the support to my country all these years. For me, and for Cubans, that means a lot, especially when we are living here in the UK, far from our own country. Okay, so I want to talk about something specific, that is the effects of the US blockade on Cuban health system. The blockade affects all spheres of Cuban life, all of them, nothing gets untouched. It has effects in every part of the Cuban life. However, the effect of the public health system, and therefore the effects on the people in a moment where people are more vulnerable, that is when the people are unwell, is, I guess, one of the best examples of how bad and unjust and criminal the US blockade is. So according to some computations that the health authorities have done, the accumulated damage to the system from 1961 reaches over $3 billion. And specifically, the blockades impede Cuba to access medical technology and equipment, medical reagents for diagnosis, diagnostics tools, but also medicines and medical supplies. And that happens always if equipment has 10% or more of US components. So any equipment can be acquired. And that is something that, say, well, you can access something else, but it's not. Because in this globalized world, most of the equipment has US components. So it doesn't matter whether the equipment is from Germany or from Switzerland or from France. If the components, some of the components are made in the United States or by an US company, we cannot acquire the equipment. Also, if the vendors are owned or they are a subsidiary of the United States, or if they have important business with the United States. And also it's affected because transportation companies are an US property or has business of a US property. And one of the scenes is that, for example, vessels, ships that comes to Cuba with equipment or with products that could be medical equipment or could be food or whatever, cannot enter in any US port if they have been in Cuba. And they cannot enter in the next 6 months. And that prevents that shipping companies, it's very hard to hire vessels to come to Cuba for that fact, because they lose money not being able to enter in the United States. Also, something else that the Ambassador Cabañas has mentioned is the persecution of financial transactions, but also of donations and transactions that are aimed to the health, to support the health system and to solve medical-related problems. And that always happens when dollars are used in the transaction, or when using any other currency, the transaction transit through an US bank or subsidiary, or it's executed, like in the case of the donation, in US controlled internet platform. And that has been many solidarity groups and organizations have suffered that the fund crowding that they have done to support specific projects or in Cuba and specific needs has been taken away for platforms such as GoFundMe or PayPal, for example. I want to put a specific example, and I think one of the clearer probably is how that affects the cancer programs in Cuba. Because all diseases are important, but cancer is something that is very easy to understand, that if you hamper the access to people, to cancer treatments, people for sure they are going to die quicker than otherwise. And specifically, the US blockade hampered the access to chemotherapy drugs, specifically when the chemotherapy drugs are still under patent, or they are novel, they are new. And also makes it difficult or even impossible to complete treatment. Patients with cancer in Cuba, sometimes they have to wait in lists until medications are available. And some patients start the treatment, and other new patients, they cannot start until this patient complete, because you cannot break the treatment. There is not enough for everybody, because those medications need to be bought outside Cuba, and they are, of course, they are hampered, the acquisition, but by all these extraterritorial law. Also, there is an accessibility of novel therapy. That is the case of brachytherapy. Brachytherapy is a new alternative for radiotherapy, where the therapy is localized and then have less side effects, but also is more effective when combined with other therapies. So Cuba, specifically, for example, children with retinoblastoma, we cannot use this type of chemotherapy. The consequence is that children have more recurrences to have a second cancer, for example. But also, given the fact that we need to use external radiotherapy that is more widespread, then they suffer facial deformation that also have psychological consequences. Other examples are here. I am not going to read it. Here you have a list in this last year, in 2019, about companies where the Cuban health system has been requesting a specific medication for treating different type of cancer. And this company, because they are US-based company or subsidiaries of US company, they do not respond to the request. And this medication only can be bought in this to them. Other examples are, for example, they make very difficult treatments in children, or other type of medication, for example, for arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, or even for helping people with discapacities, or like deaf people or blind people. Just a few examples how the blockade affects the Cuban health system. Another way of doing that is forcing Cuba then to purchase, to buy in very distant markets. And because Cuba has to go very far to acquire products that they could have otherwise acquired in the US market, the final price of equipment and products increase. And also create shipping and delivering problems, delaying the supplies to Cuba, and also produce hamper the availability of drugs. And that is something that the Cuban population has been suffering in the last year, with the accessibility of products in the Cuban pharmacy has been reduced dramatically, because the raw product for the Cuban pharmaceutical industry to produce generics needs to be acquired abroad, and then makes impossible for the Cuban pharmaceutical company to produce the medication that the Cuban patient needs. And that affects from diabetic patient to epileptic patient to patient with hypertension, with any type of disease where the patient needs a chronic treatment. And also force Cuba to buy more, actually, than what is actually needed, because then Cuba needs to be planning and to create reserve. And that, at the same time, is another problem, because we are spending moment in a specific moment of time where the other amount of money could be used for something else, because as you know, the health system is funded by the government, and resources are placed in the moment that they are needed, and many things needs to be covered. So the government needs to put money in the different affairs when they are needed. And then if you need to buy more of one specific thing for have that in a storage, that is making it harder to put money in other parts that also are needed. Then, together with all this, came COVID-19. And with COVID-19, then the Trump administration, for sure, started to make even harder. In a moment that was traumatic and hard for everybody, the lack of humanity and sensibility made Trump then to start persecuting transactions, start persecuting the acquisition of products, even in China. So prevent the acquisition through Alibaba of products that were needed to face a COVID-19 pandemic. But also then you have, as effect of the blockade, that companies that were acquired, the German and Swiss companies, where Cuba usually used to buy, for example, pulmonary ventilator for patients with respiratory complications in intensive care units. Those companies were acquired in 2018 by an US company. And therefore, when COVID-19 started, those companies informed the Cuba that they were not in the position to sell a new respirator or even a spare part to repair the equipment that Cuba had, but they were old and they were broken. As you know, COVID-19, one of the main complications are respiratory complications. So everybody, everywhere, were preparing for peak of the pandemic, where the patients were reaching the intensive care unit with breathing complications. And so for having enough ventilators ready to face and to solve the problem of those patients was a problem that every country in the pandemic needed to pay attention to and to solve. But then Cuba had the problem that it was not possible for the country to acquire or new ventilation or ventilator, or even to repair the ventilator that the country had, but were already all broken. So therefore, Cuba, as always, we were forced to find solutions. And in those solutions, the biomedical sector and the scientific pole, they were giving the task to repair all equipment, all equipment, sorry, and also to produce the spare part needed to repair the ventilator. And they did it using 3D machines, so printing the parts, but also recycling part of very old ventilators that they couldn't be used. But then was a problem of finding the blueprints of the equipment. So it was really very hard for Cuba, but they forced us to have initiative and to be innovative and find to find solutions. But despite of that, that creates a big problem for us. So also then Cuba decided to start building new ventilators thanks to those open designs that given the solidarity and the collaboration that still exists in the scientists and institutions that is present there. So the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, put free a design of an invasive ventilator that was open in the website. So Cuba took the design and started to produce a Cuban-made invasive ventilator, but also decided to produce a non-invasive variant for patients that were that have respiratory complications, but were not as critical as those that are assisted in the intensive care unit. So using another open design, in this case, University College London, the Cuban scientific pole started to produce this other type of ventilator. But then the problem was that they didn't have enough spare components and breathing circuits, and it was not possible to acquire them for all the other problems that I already mentioned. Then we here in the UK, we exchanged with our colleagues in Cuba, and we decided to start a funding campaign, a crowdfunding, that was open during 1.5 months, and we succeeded collecting £26,000, where many people donated, Cubans, but also no Cuban, friends of Cuba, and people that are sensibilized with the problem in Cuba. And so we collected that money, and with that money, we bought the circuits for completing the non-invasive ventilator that the biomedical sector was producing. So, but that was not enough, because for Trump it's never enough. So then they also started or make harder a discredit campaign that had started years ago. That is not new. The discredit campaign against Cuban medical cooperation started years ago, but it has been harder in the last month during COVID-19, given that Cuba has been offering help to many countries facing the pandemic. Then starting to claim that the medical brigades, the doctors, in fact, they are a slave of the dictatorship of the Cuban system. However, the truth is that behind this discredit campaign, what is hidden, first is that they are not interested in the truth. They are not interested in the fact. What they are looking is for another way of supporting the permanence of the US blockade, but also to affect Cuban economy with all these lies that they spread about Cuban cooperation. Because the truth is that Cuba offered free medical cooperation to those countries that are not able to afford it. And those doctors are not paid. Those doctors go to these countries as these ones that I are showing here in the list for free, paying attention, giving care to patients in very remote areas, in areas where probably they have never seen a medical doctor. So, and then you have also the cases where Cuba also has been paying attention to patients during disaster, national disasters and catastrophes, as it has been the case of hurricane, has been the case of earthquakes, has been the case of tsunami, or during the Ebola pandemic 2 years ago. So this brigade, that is the Henry Reed brigades that are prepared to face disasters and situation of catastrophic situation now, for the response that these brigades have given to facing the COVID-19 pandemic in so many countries, they have been proposed for the Nobel Peace, for the Nobel for Peace. So, I guess that Helen later, she can speak a little bit more about this. It's true that we have a second type of cooperation that is paid. It's true, but that is a slavery. It is a slavery when the doctors go to those brigades in a voluntary way. They enroll because they want to be part of that strategy. But also doctors, when they go abroad, they receive a full salary in Cuba, when they are not even practicing in Cuba, but in another country. And at the same time, they receive a percentage of the money that the countries pay for that cooperation. And the other percentage that is through go to the health system is there supporting the free and universal coverage that Cuba provides to every Cuban, doesn't matter where the Cuban is, irrespective of political affiliation, irrespective of sex, irrespective of any belief that the Cuban could have. Otherwise, from where the money could come in a country that is facing a blockade and is also a poor country. And the second thing is that the paid medical cooperation is sustained with those countries that cannot afford it. For example, Qatar, Kuwait, Portugal. Those countries have more money than Cuba, and it's a fair way of cooperation with both countries benefit. Cuba gives the expertise, gives the doctors that they don't have, well, they give the Cuba an amount of money that for sure is much less that they could pay for any doctor for any other part of the world. So finally, I want to close here, hoping that in 2021, we will have a Cuba without a blockade. And that will depend also on each of us raising our voice for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Valia. I love the way you ended there, and it will be our voices that make a difference. On that note, we have fraternal greetings from the Norwegian Cuban Association who are in the room tonight. We have greetings from the Cuban Support Island, CSGI. Look out for the hashtag Walking for Cuba. And also the Partito Comunista Italy, the British branch of the Italian Communist Party, also send their greetings. And it is our voices that will make the difference. Okay, I'm now going to pass on to our next speaker. It is Helen Yaffe, lecturer at the University of Glasgow and author of this book, We Are Cuba: How a Revolutionary People Have Survived a Post-Soviet World. We've been discussing this in various Zoom meetings across the country, and I do recommend everyone having a copy. So over to Helen now, and hopefully, I think she's got some slides. That's great, thank you. Ruby's posted a link to the book in the chat as well. Helen.
So one sec. So for those of you who are sitting there thinking that, you know, this is a US-Cuba issue and isn't it terrible and what can we do, this is the presentation for you, because I'm going to talk about Britain and the US and Cuba, a contradictory relationship. So this is really what we mean by extraterritorial, and this is where we all come in, and where the US blockade is a question for all of us, as Valia said. You know, whether 2021 is a year without the US blockade will also depend on us. So just to really, I'm a historian, and like Valia, I can talk the hind legs off a donkey. I'm trying to keep my presentation short, so I'm going to give a very succinct history here. In 1961, January, most of you will know, the United States broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba. Britain did not. Britain maintained its embassy in Cuba. So I say contradictory because at the same time there was an unofficial agreement between the US government and the British embassy that it should act unofficially as Washington's eyes and ears in Havana, as a listening post. There's all sorts of stories about how particularly during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the members of the British embassy were driving around following, trying to track down the Soviet movements, which was difficult because they had quite distinctive cars from the 1950s Cadillac that filled the streets of Havana. But British companies that were subject to the process of nationalisation by the revolutionary government did accept compensation. They came to the agreements that were offered by the United States. And let me just reiterate that that compensation was offered to US companies and other European companies, and the US companies were advised by their government not to accept, while other European countries did. So Britain's still there, it's still trading, but it comes under immense pressure. There's a lot of archived documents showing letters from the President of the United States pressuring the Prime Minister and the Cabinet and so on to cut relations with Cuba. And a lot of things were pulled back and restrained, but there is this extraordinary case of the 1964 sale of British Leyland buses to Cuba. Immense pressure was put on the British government not to allow this to happen, but they went ahead anyway, and Cuba needed buses for its public transport system. Then I'm jumping ahead, which I don't like to do as a historian, but in 1980 in Britain you had something called the UK Protection of Trading Interests Act, which specified that it would be illegal for companies in Britain or individuals to comply with the extraterritorial legislation of the US blockade, or as they refer to it, embargo. So what that means, extraterritorial, is the US can, of course, pass any law it likes for its own companies and citizens. The democracy or justness of that is one matter. The next matter is that something that's passed as a US law should not apply in another sovereign country. So this is what this law said. And in fact, on paper, companies which submitted to US legislation and US courts could be fined under this British Act. So I'm jumping ahead again to look at Britain, the EU and the Helms-Burton Act. In 1996, Britain, for the first time, supported the resolution, which has now become an annual resolution since just before that, where Cuba goes to the United Nations General Assembly and presents a motion to condemn the United States blockade. 95, Britain abstained. In 96, Britain supports Cuba in the UN General Assembly, along with the vast majority of the world, by the way, which continues to be the case. What was going on? Well, in 1986, as Cabañas has already talked about, and Gloria La Riva, the Helms-Burton Act was passed in the United States, and as Gloria was saying, it was in response to the Cubans' defense of their territory with the flight of the Brothers to Rescue planes and so on. Anyway, the point is, the Helms-Burton Act has 4 titles, and Title 3 is this one that Cabañas was talking about, that says that any foreign individual entity that does business, that traffics in business that previously belonged to a citizen of the United States before the nationalizations can be taken to court and sued. Now, there is something I want to specify. One of the peculiarities of the Helms-Burton Act, a total violation of legal norms, is it gives retrospectively the status of American citizen or US citizen to people who at the time the law was introduced, the nationalizations took place, were actually Cuban citizens. This is one of the total abnormalities of this law. Anyway, so the Title III basically had major implications for British, European, Canadian, Brazilian business people or individuals or any entities who were engaging in any way with Cuba. It suggested that although they are sovereign citizens of their own state, they could be sued by US courts that actually have no jurisdiction over them. So Canada and the EU specifically reacted by adopting what's called blocking and clawback legislation. In other words, they said, if you try and take our citizens or government or individuals to court or entities to court, we will launch counter legal measures. And this will create this can of worms and a very messy scenario which no one ever gets out of, and the only people who come out benefiting are the lawyers who get rich. So Canada said it would take this legal action within NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Area, and the European Union was going to take it through the WTO. Great, you can say, they stood up to the US blockade. Not that simple. What happened was the following year in 1997, EU and the United States make a deal. The US agrees to limit the impact of certain provisions of the Helms-Burton Act, and in response, the EU will freeze the threat of legal action or freeze the legal action it's already started. So the US agrees to suspend Title III, which is this title of the Helms-Burton Act that affects British citizens, Canadian citizens, EU citizens. It will suspend it every 6 months. But the condition is, so long as the EU and other allies continue their stepped up efforts to promote democracy in Cuba. Well, I think most people here will be clear on what they mean by promote democracy. Essentially, to promote regime change in Cuba and to undermine the socialist revolution. And totally consistent with that agreement, in 1996, the European Union, of which Britain is a part, adopts the common position on Cuba. The common position is essentially a political attack or critique of Cuba. It says that we will limit engagement even at the diplomatic level unless Cuba basically does, as we say, carries out a transition from its socialist state into a, as they call it, free and fair, free multi-party elections and a market economy, in other words, capitalism. Okay, so what happens? This is the situation. It starts to change with rapprochement between the United States and Cuba, which is announced on the surprise of many people in December 2014. And this immediately acts as a green light. It's called the demonstration effect to British, EU, and other companies around the world. Engagement with Cuba steps up. In 2016, the EU and Cuba sign a political dialogue and cooperation agreement to replace the previously hostile common position, and trade and investment start to grow. They're still restricted because of the US blockade, but there is a significant improvement and prospects. Then, on the 2nd of May, when the United States actually lifts the suspension of Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, so allows that provision that US courts can charge and fine citizens of Britain, EU, and elsewhere, anywhere in the world, Britain and the EU respond robustly in words. They reject Title III and they threaten again to take legal action. They said, we started this process before, we can still do it. But we have to ask the question, beyond the sounds and fury, what action have they taken? When I was carrying out the interviews for my book, which thanks Susie for plugging there, I spoke to the EU ambassador to Cuba in Havana, and he admitted the EU should be more assertive about the US embargo. He admitted it's the biggest burden on development in Cuba, but he pointed out Cuba represents 0.1% of the EU's external trade, whereas for EU countries, including Britain, the United States, is a much higher proportion, and essentially they are not prepared to confront the US, even though it's a violation of domestic and regional laws. The US, let's be clear, is the greatest violation of human rights in Cuba. It's also a violation of our own rights. I'm going to show you just one example. This is my last slide. There are, in fact, multiple examples of how the extraterritorial imposition of the US blockade has affected people, individuals, commercial, non-commercial, as Valia was talking about, humanitarian projects, charity projects, has affected individuals in violation of British laws, despite the regulations and laws that exist to block it. So this is a letter that was sent by HSBC, a British bank, to a small entity in this country who was engaging with Cuba. And I'm not going to name names for specific reasons, but they were instructed to comply with this form that says that they will not conduct any transaction involving HSBC holdings, its subsidiaries, associated and affiliated companies. Any action that contravenes sanctions implemented or administered by the HM Treasury, European Union, the United States Treasury Department Office of Foreign Asset Controls, that is the entity of the US that implements the US blockade and the terrible fines that Cabañas was referring to, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and so on. This relates to the Crimean region, Cuba, Iran, Syria, and North Korea. So even though there is legislation and regulations in Britain, in Europe, in Canada, to block the US blockade, they are redundant because they are not practiced. They are not put into practice. They are not actioned. And financial institutions particularly are bullying people. They have confiscated money raised in charitable events and so on, as the case many of you will know about the project to send the piano to Cuba, which had money taken off it by Eventbrite and then by Stripe. So the point is, if the extraterritorial reach of the US blockade was properly opposed, it would significantly weaken the impact on Cuba and Cuban development. We saw that the blockade existed throughout the first 30 years of the Cuban Revolution. But as Cuba had the possibility of trade, investment, exchange, and so on with the Soviet bloc, it was able to survive. If the rest of the world would actually take a stand and oppose the US blockade legislation now, then Cuba would also have the breathing space that it needs, that is people need, and that is what I'm calling on everyone here to demand. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Helen. And so important, we need to stop the extraterritorial reach of the US blockade. We all have a role to play in that. Okay, we're now coming on to our final speaker of the night. I do have a number of people that I know have sent questions in. I have a couple of people who have been in touch as well before the meeting started, and I will take as well. But I want to hand over to Barbara Montalvo, the Cuban ambassador to Britain, and is going to be talking to us, and we're very privileged to have you here. So thank you so much. I'm hoping that you're unmuted.
Okay.
Thank you, brilliant.
Greetings to all participants. I'm really delighted to share this time with members of Around the Blockade, with Helen, Ambassador Cabaña, Gloria, Dr. Valia, and with all of you. I'm going to briefly refer to further aspects of the situation in Cuba in the scenario being described by other speakers. First of all, I would like to mention that the already ongoing transformation process endorsed in the new constitution will continue. Our vision is that it is fully enforced, and it has been seen even under the pandemic circumstances. The decisions made are also articulated with Cuba's socio-economic strategy aimed at facing the global crisis caused by the pandemic and the tightening of the US blockade. Our main source of income, health, remittances, tourism, are constantly attacked to asphyxiate the economy. You know, we have our economic and social development plan until 2030, but due to the new circumstances, an adjustment has been made, and the Council of Ministers approved the strategic plan to confront COVID-19 as well as the functioning of the economy in the recovery phase. I want to reiterate that the Cuban government will never apply neoliberal recepts to solve problems. We reject the implementation of shock therapies, and all our plans include support for anyone who finds themselves in a vulnerable situation, emphasizing that the reordering will in no way jeopardize the achievements of the revolution. The measures approved by the Council of Ministers are intended to boost business activity and investments based on the new tax, credit, and salary incentives. The purpose is to provide greater autonomy to companies for managing and reinvesting part of their profits to promote exports from the direct management of financial or commercial credits by the company, as well as to empower the non-state sector and link it to state companies. Likewise, local governments are empowered to use funds generated in their territory to finance new investments and provide capital for the creation of companies, which widens territorial autonomy. The three fundamental aspects of our work are: first, containing the pandemic; second, confronting, resisting, and denouncing the blockade; and third, implementing our economic and social strategy. Our enemies are trying to cause a social explosion in Cuba. The main Cuban laws, all the measures concerning the population, we discuss them and create the necessary spaces for the people to give their opinion and make suggestions. This has also been done now, as we did during the process of debate of the new Cuban Constitution project, in which almost 9 million people took part. We have introduced now a partial dollarization of the economy, which is a temporary measure. It might not be very popular in Cuba, and maybe among some of you, but I really believe that we strongly need it right now. And I'm referring to the stores selling products only in foreign currencies. It is true that those with freely convertible currency are privileged, but the purpose is that this income is used to improve the supply in the national currency markets. These have not been easy decisions to take. And as it has been the practice in Cuba, we explained to the population the reasons why we had to do it. Additionally, we are focusing on the transformation of agriculture and the reorganization of our enterprise system. We seek to increase industrial production, expand the supply of goods and services available, make progress on the strengthening of state-owned enterprises, and transform and modernize trade. Priority is being given to production linkage in areas such as the food industry or food production, the construction industry, among others. On the issue of monetary restructuring, the population will be kept well informed as the process advances. Unification of the country's dual currency system is not a magical solution to all of our financial problems, but it should lead to increased labor productivity and more efficient performance of the productive forces. As part of the process, some unwarranted subsidies will also be terminated, while wage, pension, and price reform are to be implemented. The state will ensure the population's bank deposits and those of national and foreign legal entities, as well as all cash, no matter the currency. The export sector will benefit by receiving higher income from exported products. And the price correction is facilitated, which should allow national goods to be less expensive than imported goods. And incentives are created to increase efficiency and competitiveness in the enterprise sector. Addressing the adjustment in relations between the state and non-state sectors will favor possibilities for complementarity between the two. For example, allowing non-state management to export from specialized state companies and creating the design of micro, medium, and small business, not exclusive to the private sector. Within this strategy, the computerization process of Cuban society and telecommunications are a key element for development. And of course, all of we do must to respect environmental and sustainable development policies, which are priorities for Cuba. Our parliament continues to work on the discussion and approval of the bills that will give the legal framework to the modifications introduced in the new constitution. As you surely know, the National Assembly approved yesterday some of these bills, including the Foreign Service Bill of the Republic of Cuba. We are taking another step forward today, decisive for our battle against the pandemic and for the immediate future of Cuba. From our point of view, we need to learn to live with the disease, reinitiate economic and social activities, strengthen prevention and treatment protocols, and aim at a new normality with a minimum of risk, ensuring no mistakes. It is time to move towards greater people's participation and shared responsibility. The role of young people and students, along with the participation of local authorities, political and mass organization, and the population has been impressive. And without those support, everything would have been more difficult. For us, the adoption of a new behavior code and lifestyle is fundamental, incorporating all the learning that has allowed us to reach to this moment, not as temporary measures, but rather essential routines, as our President Díaz-Canel has expressed. On October 12th, Cuba has begun a new normality after months of an extremely difficult battling the pandemic while facing the increasingly aggressive blockade imposed by the USA and without renouncing efforts to advance our economic and social approach. I wish the times to come will be better for everyone. And thanks a lot to Rock Around the Blockade for your solidarity and permanent support to Cuban people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lots of appreciation there, Barbara. Thank you so much for outlining that so clearly. These are extremely difficult times, you know, around the world. And what I took away from that was the democratic process of debating Cuba, where the whole population is involved in the difficult decisions that you're having to make. 9 million people, listen to that, 9 million people took part in discussions on the Constitution. People are discussing every aspect of their society and the decisions that are being made. There was a question that came up about actually how do we prove how democratic Cuba is? And I hope that the person who asked the question is taking on board these points made by the speakers. Thank you so much, Barbara. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I've got lots of questions and I'm grouping them together and then putting them to the speakers. And we are pressed for time. So before we do that, I would like to ask Ria from the Revolutionary Communist Group to say a few words, because we are talking about what we can do here as well. Thank you, Ria.
Thank you, Susie, and thank you to all of the speakers. So yeah, I'm from the Revolutionary Communist Group, and we set up Rock Around the Blockade in 1995 because we have to defend socialist Cuba. We understand that we have to defend socialist Cuba if we want to build a socialist and communist revolution in Britain. And those of us in Britain have so much to learn from Cuba. We, Rock Around the Blockade, actually held a meeting in July, which was all about Cuba's response to the coronavirus pandemic and how outstanding that has been. And that's not only, some of the speakers have spoken about their international solidarity, sending thousands of medical professionals around the world to help in this fight against COVID, on top of the already tens of thousands of Cuban medical professionals who were serving in communities all over the world. But not only that, their response domestically, having medical students go door to door to check on all the households who are in Cuba. Do people have symptoms? Do they need support? Do they need to be isolated? The Cuban state was able to pull together this database of those who have underlying health conditions, so that if these people contracted the virus, they would know how many ICU beds they would need, how many ventilators they would need. It was all planned in advance. And the Cuban state was able to do that, not only because they have a planned economy, but because of the kinds of infrastructures they have in place, the healthcare infrastructures. So they have a socialized healthcare system, a single, universal, free healthcare system, which seeks prevention over cure. And Cuban doctors live in their communities. They know, they serve in their communities. They know their patients. And the Cuban state has this approach to healthcare because they're communist and because the people are the state. The state is the people. So it therefore serves in the best interest of the people, not of capital, like we see in Britain. So yeah, it's also important to point out the fact that Cuba has made all these incredible gains despite the centuries of purposefully being underdeveloped by imperialism and while being blockaded by the world's largest imperialist power, supported by Britain. And yeah, we have to hold up, us in Britain, we have to hold up the banner of Cuban socialism everywhere. We have to go onto the streets and tell people about this, tell people about Cuba, not only to defend Cuba and the Cuban Revolution against the imperialist attacks that we have heard the speakers talk about today, but also to show people in Britain that actually another world is possible if only we're prepared to fight for it and make it happen. So this meeting has been brilliant, and again, thank you so much to all of the speakers, and I'm now so excited to take what we've learned here today onto the streets, and I hope that everyone else in this meeting is as well, and is going to actually take what we've discussed and apply it to the world around us, because we don't just want to look at Cuba and look at its revolutionary consciousness, its participatory democracy, its gains in healthcare, in education, in international solidarity. We want to emulate Cuba, and we want to build a society here in Britain which is based on those same principles. But in order to do that, we have to get organised. What Cuba stands to show is that it is only through socialism, and it is only by being communist, that we can actually create a world that is fit for the whole of humanity. So if you are not already a member of the Revolutionary Communist Group, then you need to get involved now, today, because it's the only way forward for humanity. So myself, Patrick, Cassandra and Elias will be messaging participants to try and find people who want to help us build this movement, and please get in touch and respond to us if you do, or fill in the form on our website, the Revolutionary Communist Group. Thank you.
Thank you, Ria. And there is no time like the present, people. It's all happening now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple of questions, 3 questions. I have Ike Naham in the room somewhere, and he is from the US-Cuba Normalization Committee, and he will be talking about a solidarity conference. Ike, if it's okay, I'm going to ask the 3 questions first, and then your contribution, I think, will support those questions and what they are proposing. So one of the questions came from someone, Hughes from Belfast. He said, with America's reversal of fortunes in Bolivia, with Venezuela still standing, and the ending of Pinochet's constitution in Chile, how can socialism in Latin America and the Caribbean strengthen from this? Should there be a global anti-imperialist multipolar coalition? There was another question from a DM in Glasgow who said, with the defeat of the coup in Bolivia and the victories won by the protesters in Chile, is this a sign that the situation in Latin America is improving? And what does this mean for Cuba's position in the region? And lastly, a question from Domi. Do the panel speakers agree with the statement that by defending humanity, Cuba defends itself? How important do they feel Cuba's internationalism is to defending the revolution and building, reinforcing socialist consciousness in the population? So some questions there about Latin America, about building socialist populism in Cuba or around the world. So shall I go first to Ike to tell us a little bit more about the Normalization Committee and Solidarity Conference? And then would the speakers like to indicate if they would like to come back on what is happening in Latin America and the implications that has for Cuba and the US?
Okay, thank you, Susie. And I would like to give greetings to Ambassador Cabañas and Ambassador Montalvo, and to my friends and both sisters, Helen Yaffe and Gloria La Riva, longtime fellow Cuba Solidarity activists and fighters. I will lead into the description of this big upcoming conference. I hope I tried to send some information out. Maybe it can be shared, but if not, if everybody could just, okay, wonderful. There you go. Fantastic. So this is coming up. Before I get into it, I would just like to say that we've heard tonight about the tremendous escalation of U.S. policy over the last few years under the Trump administration. And at the same time, the other side of that and the terrible impact of that on our sisters and brothers in Cuba. But at the same time, the other side of that is its absolute political isolation and unsustainability and the growing hatred and opposition to it. And that marks the period that we're in right now. And so this conference that we're organizing is trying to unite forces in the United States, Canada, across the Western Hemisphere for a 3-day weekend conference, webinars against the blockade. Please go to the website. You can click on, we have a tremendous concert, international concert with leading Cuban, Canadian, US musicians on Friday night, and poets from Cuba. Be great. And then Saturday and Sunday, we have sessions that will assess some of the things that have been discussed here tonight, but I'll have the advantage, although we don't know for sure what the actual reality will be, but we know it'll be a different one, since after the end of the election period and what happens, and we'll be able to look at that. Actually, Ambassador Cabañas is going to be joining us on that first panel along with on Saturday, along with Ambassador Josefina Vidal from Cuba's ambassador to Canada. And Sunday, we're also going to be introducing in a panel Ambassador Pedroso, who's the new Cuban ambassador to the United Nations as a veteran revolutionary diplomat, and we'll be speaking along with Fernando Gonzalez from the president of ECAP. This is the 60th anniversary of ECAP. So there'll be discussions on different struggles. Our motivation and our idea and perspective is to make 2021 the year to deal decisive blows to the blockade, because we think this policy is unsustainable, it's politically hated, and we see and isolated, and we see a trajectory going through next year. There's this vote scheduled. Somebody alluded to the vote every year in the UN, which is overwhelmingly against Cuba, for Cuba, against the US policy. And this year on May 21st, the vote is scheduled. And then out of this conference, we hope to see internationally coordinated actions, and we'll be projecting that and other things. So I think this is going to be a great weekend. We're going to have Cuban medical personnel that have been part of these brigades. And please go to the website, us-cubanormalization.org. You could get all the details, learn about the Saving Lives campaign for US-Cuba-Canada medical cooperation, and we hope to involve many sisters and brothers from the UK, from the broader solidarity movement, from Rock Against the Blockade. Thank you so much for letting me on and to talk about this, and thank you for putting on this terrific program today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ike. Thank you for that. So yeah, do check that out, and maybe we can put a link also in the chat if anyone's got a link to that. So just again, maybe this question should be for the ambassadors, Jose and Barbara. I mean, there's been a massive change in the situation in Latin America with the elections in Bolivia, obviously the ending of Pinochet's constitution in Chile, and Venezuela is still standing. So it'd be good to know if this is going to have a positive impact in the region for Cuba and against the US blockade.
Please, Cabañas.
I think we need to unmute.
Okay, thank you. Well, those are interesting questions. I will have some comments and to react to probably the three of them. First, let me tell you that since we are very young and we go to school, we all in Cuba are educated that humanity is our homeland. Then if we want to be in a better world, we have to share with other people what we get. Personally, I can tell you, I learned about minorities the first time I traveled abroad when I was a university student, and I visited a foreign country, and people asked me about Afro-Cubans, about women, about Aboriginal people. We in Cuba, we don't have a clue about minorities. We are all Cubans. Even when Cubans travel abroad and they are asked, what are you? Are you Afro something? Are you Hispanic? No, I'm a Cuban. I mean, for us to say I'm a Cuban is enough. Being a woman, being a gay as lesbian, whatever. Then what I'm trying to say that since we are very young, we are educated in that direction. It has to do with the Cuban Revolution. It has to do with Jose Marti's ideas, our national hero. Now, in terms of, and probably related to that, the meaning of these changes in Latin America. Well, this is acting like a pendulum now. And what we get these days, being Bolivia, which is historic, what they have accomplished in a few months, reverting a coup that in other countries took many, many years to reverse the situation, and they have done that in a few months. What you have seen in Chile and the resistance of the Venezuelan people and in other places, the incredible support that the Caribbean countries, small island states, are providing to Cuba. There is no way that the United States can break that block of support. Countries that they don't have a major wealth, but still they understand and they feel the solidarity from Cuba, and they simply respond to that. Well, the bottom line is that neoliberalism meant poverty for Latin America. As simple as that. And when those recipes, economic recipes, were tried to be implemented in Latin America, you had huge and very rich countries like Argentina now becoming a poor country. And you had people starving in countries that were exporter of food for the whole history. Then it's probably some scholars will tell you this is a pendulum, but it's the logic reaction. I mean, if you have the whole wealth on 1% of the population and you have 99% of people starving and when necessities, of course, people have to react to that. Now, Latin American and Caribbean region is if humankind is our homeland, but our region is, I mean, our home is Latin America and Caribbean countries. And let's remember something. In early 60s, when the United States tried to isolate Cuba from the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean, what happened? Well, most countries broke relationships with Cuba, with the exception of Mexico and Canada. But then Cuba became the capital of all social movements in Latin America. And then we started in Havana. Remember the Latin American, Asian, and African conferences, OSPAL at the time. Cuba became, because they tried to isolate Cuba, and then suddenly Cuba was, I would say, in fashion. I mean, everyone wanted to visit Cuba. We hosted, I don't know how many social leaders that afterwards became presidents or prime ministers or ministers in their countries. If we have some changes in the way the previous American administration handled bilateral ties with Cuba, one of the reasons that brought Barack Obama and his government to think twice about the policy about Cuba was precisely the kind of support that the Cuba received from every single country in Latin America. Remember that the last Summit of America, before that announcement, the message that the US received, the US delegation received at that conference was, on the next one, you have to invite Cuba or we don't have summits anymore. Then that relationship, that kind of relationship that we have established not only with leftist governments or progressive governments, with everybody in the region. And you can go country by country, and the bilateral relationship with Cuba means a lot with them. United States, the political class in the United States has come to a time where they understand that it's meaningful and it's useful to have a working relationship with Cuba, to say the least, in order to have a better relationship with Latin America. And we feel as countries that we are a group, we are a family, we belong together. And when one is missing, well, something will happen. Those are my reactions to those three questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. And I'm going to ask some other questions now, and they are based on the medical side of the blockade, and obviously also address some of the points raised about the pandemic and COVID-19. So one of the questions was raised, they haven't said their name, but that we have a revolutionary Cuban in the audience who knows and appreciates the Cuban medical system, and it has been in a difficult situation because his daughter or baby has a situation where they need an operation and some Dennis Brown splints, and you know, because of the situation they are blockaded, they cannot get this basic medical aid. So there was a question about how can we access that, and I hope that if we could get this person's details, we could put them in touch with Valia. Valia, there was also a question about, you talked about the cost of the ventilators. How much does it also cost to, on average, how much would it cost to keep these ventilators going and keep up so that they can be used for a longer term? And how is the best money to get, how is the best way to get money that goes directly to the Cuban health sector? There were two questions, and forgive me if I pronounce it wrong, but the Soberana 01 vaccine, one of them was about, will the blockade be lifted if this vaccine can do what it, you know, could do, save people during the pandemic? Will the blockade be lifted because of that? Or what if this vaccine falls into the wrong hands and, you know, people profit from that? I think that is it. There might have been one more health question, but I think those are the questions sort of looking at the situation now with the blockade and the impact on everyday medicines in Cuba, and also the situation with the vaccine and how best we can support. So I think I'll go straight to Valia first. Valia, just to let you know, it's nearly 10 minutes past 9, and I've got another group of questions after this. So if you could keep quite succinct, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, let's start for Soberana 1. Sovereign is the Soberana 1. So actually we have Soberana 1, and now we have Soberana 2. We have 2 now. So both in clinical trials now, registered and in clinical trials. First, they cannot go to wrong hands because the hands are the hands of the Cubans. So, and we give the vaccine, or we will give the vaccines for sure. And we are not only producing the vaccine for us, to have a vaccine for every Cuban, but for also a previous vaccine, like meningo vaccines and others, for people that also could need it. That is one thing. That makes us free to have our own vaccine despite Germans or Americans or British vaccines, to have our own vaccine. So hopefully we will see. So that things about going to wrong hand, we can discard that, because that will be the hands of the Cuban science and the Cuban health system. And we have demonstrated that we know how to handle our own products and our biotechnology results well. So there is a previous experience on that. So that is regarding going to wrong hand, but there was something else regarding the vaccine. I don't really remember. It was so many things that you said about that I don't.
Yeah, I think if there is a vaccine that is, and then after the clinical trials, it is shown to prevent or limit the impact of COVID-19, would the blockade be lifted in that circumstance?
I don't think so. The blockade is not going to depend on that. We have other products that have been very valuable and could be very valuable for the US citizens. And not because of that, the blockade has been released. Just the opposite, entering to the American market, that is one important market, because unfortunately it's very big, and other companies also needs to enter in the American market, also makes difficult for us to negotiate with other companies to penetrate the pharmaceutical market that is very difficult to penetrate. You need the tradition, you need money. So even making negotiations with pharmaceuticals in other countries, like say UK pharmaceutical or German pharmaceutical, is hard for us because then they cannot go inside the American market. That is the final goal of everybody because it's a very big market. So US, we have been even talking to Pfizer and companies in the United States for the cancer biotechnology product that we have. And that is something that we never have really been able to achieve because of the US embargo. So there are many, the embargo put many limitations, even is a scientific institution, and even the pharmaceutical companies themselves wants to do deals and collaboration. So I don't think the embargo is going to change anything because we have our Cuban vaccine. Because it's a Cuban vaccine or like the Russian vaccine, they are going always to look for excuses, and they are going also to try to victimize the, or to make another discredit campaign against our vaccines in the same way that they have done it already. So no, the answer is no. The release of the blockade is not going to depend on that for sure.
Thank you so
much. So the question relating to ventilators.
Yeah.
Ventilators, okay. Cuba has been producing the both type of ventilator, invasive and non-invasive, with national resources. So the main things that Cuba needs is also the parts that are not long-lasting, but those that are disposable. Like, for example, the breathing circuits, you can use it once, 2 times, but then you need to dispose. So you need all the time new breathing circuits. So, and that means money. So one way is to support always that in supplies, the system. So sending money to Cuba is good, but also sending already the product or the parts that Cuba needs is also very important, because we already saw how buying things, acquiring materials and acquiring parts is a problem for Cuba because of the embargo or the blockade. So then having list, exchanging with the health system and having a list of what the health system needs actually, or what the scientific institution needs or the biomedical sector needs to go on and to face and to give a good response, an appropriate response to problems, and then buying those components and sending that to Cuba is a good way of supporting, besides sending money.
Thank you so much. We need these lists, and actually Gloria also asked for a list of the cancer medications that are needed in Cuba. So I hope that we can get to the bottom of this, and this is something that can practically come out of this meeting. I'm going to ask Helen Yaffe now to speak, because I believe that there is a documentary coming out on this issue.
Yeah, I see that Valia's left it for me to to present. So we are working on a documentary, and Valia and I presenting. It's being produced by Danny Films and collaboration with Belly of the Beast. I hope lots of you have seen the fantastic programs they've been doing on Transform Cuba, and perhaps I think perhaps there's a chance of showing the final episode at the end of this meeting. Anyway, we've been interviewing some of the top medical scientists in Cuba. Luis Herrera, who was behind the development of interferons in 1986, the head of research at the Neuroscience Center where Balia worked for a long time, the head of research in the Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, which is just producing a great range of products, also a family doctor, one of the 28,000 Cuban medical students who, as the universities were closed, joined forces with the family doctors who are in every community and every barrio in Cuba to go door knocking in pursuit of COVID-19. We've also interviewed Joana Tablada from the Ministry of Foreign Relations, who's the second there in terms of US-Cuba relations. So I hope that, Ruby, you can send the link round, you can register for the premiere of the documentary, which is on Wednesday, the 11th of November. And don't worry if you missed that, because we'll be showing it just 2 days later at the Havana Glasgow Film Festival, which you should also check out. It's a great film festival with lots of other activities like a MasterChef cooking lesson and salsa class for kids and so on. And that's we'll be showing our documentary on the Friday the 13th of November. So, and then it will be made available to sort of get the inside track on how Cuba coped and how it coped in such difficult circumstances when, as Susie said at the beginning, since the beginning of the pandemic, 40 new measures have been taken by the Trump administration. This is after 200 have already been taken since the beginning, and a nation that's been sanctioned for 60 years. So how on earth have they managed to come out of this pandemic so so exemplary and such an example to the world? Well, we hope we have some of the answers for you in the documentary. So please register today. Okay,
thank you so much, Helen and Balia, for those answers. Okay, I've got some more questions. These questions, one is from the room. It's from Athena, who says, during the last debate, as well as the previous foreign policy, Biden's warmonger attitude towards Latin America demonstrates his keen interest in further destabilizing socialist Latin American nations. If Biden is elected, do you think that he will enact tighter restrictions towards Cuba or adopt a new strategy for the region? And we also have another question that was sent in before the meeting that says, Joe Biden has promised to restore US leadership in the world, accusing Trump of squandering the US's reputation, tearing up alliances with EU, NATO, etc., driving towards protectionism. What would Joe Biden's presidency really mean for Cuba and Latin America? So I'm interested to see, oh yeah, brilliant. Jose, would you like to come back on those?
Okay.
There you go. Yeah, perfect.
Thank you. Well, some general comments. First, United States as a country has many problems domestically. Let's see how much time a new president has about leadership in the world or something like that. They have to fix several structural problems they have domestically. Now, in terms of Cuba, former Vice President Biden, his person in the ticket, I mean, Senator Harris and others, they have said that at least they were returned to the point where they were, where we were before. I mean, when Vice President Biden was part of the Obama administration. Our reaction, you would imagine we have many people asking the same questions, try to wonder which would be a relationship with the United States in the future. What we have to say is that our principles will be the same. I mean, from Cuba, we are ready to deal with any government in the United States that shows respect, that would like to be involved in respectful conversation and exchange with Cuba, that believe in reciprocity and don't consider us as, you know, something different from that. We are not betting on any specific candidate. We are not betting on an outcome of this election. And we will expect and wait until the elections are over. We have authorities in power, January 20th, and to see their readiness to engage in such an exchange, in such a dialogue with Cuba. In the past, before 2015, many people in the United States had a question mark if Cuba would engage in negotiations with the United States, if those negotiations would be productive. But I don't think that people have that question anymore, because in the short period of time, like 2 years or something, we were able to sign 23 MOUs covering from reestablishing diplomatic ties to health, agriculture, law enforcement, climate change, etc. Then on the American side, we have been talking about diseases and health. The leading experts in the United States, they know what is available in Cuba. And you got the question about Soberana 01, or Sovereign 01. Well, we have the biotechnology industry that has been in place for the last 30, 40 years in Cuba. And we have products like HeverPro P that prevent amputation of the diabetes foot ulcer. We have prevented 73% of amputations in Cuba. In the United States, you have roughly 70,000 amputations a year related with diabetes that could be stopped in the coming year if they would have the willingness to do that. And you have many issues outside health, for instance, drug trafficking and alien smuggling in the region, that authorities in the United States, those people that remain on their jobs, no matter who is governing, experts and leading officials on those sectors, they know and they understand very well the kind of response they get from Cuba when they do cooperate. If next authorities in the United States want to impose the same policy that is failed, because you have to be a wise person to discover that this is a failed policy, and they want only to bet on a few votes in Florida, when we will until the next election comes and the next government is elected. But Cuba will never ever renounce to its principle. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's so important. Cuba will never renounce its principles. I feel that it is now 9:21, and what we would like to do is show the last part of the Belly in the Beast section on Cuba, on the blockade. But I just feel I'm really find it very hard to not share some of the other points that people made. And I think it's really important to note historically Cuba's internationalism in the world. And one of the questions came in actually about what is happening now in Nigeria, the rebellion against the government and the special anti-robbery squad, SARS, but making a note of the complicity, British complicity in the oppression that is there in Nigeria, the historical work of Unilever, the Royal Niger Company and BP, and it talks about Cuba's internationalist role in Africa has been very different, supporting popular resistance to imperialism and progressive social movements. And the question was about, you know, how do progressive movements in Africa connect to Cuban socialism and anti-imperialist resistance? There was another question about the fact that, you know, Cuba has provided in the past, political asylum for the Black Panther Party members, and you know, people in the US are worried. They are Marxists, they're outspoken, they're on the streets, and they're saying, is there any chance we could get asylum there? I think we haven't got time to answer these questions in detail. There was another question about how little the democratic process is here in Britain. I think the most important thing we can do now is stay in touch. So I'm hoping that, as Ria said, there have been people making links with you during the meeting. If you haven't been contacted, just because there is so many people in the room, then please do contact us. There are a number of ways you can do that have been coming up in the chat, because the discussion doesn't stop here. The discussion is a very large one, and we have a responsibility now more than ever to show our complete solidarity and support for Cuba, not just in Zoom meetings or on the internet, on Facebook pages, but out on the streets. So I'm going to ask the speakers if there was anything they wanted to do to come back. We have 5 minutes maximum. If there's any points that people would like to come back on. It's quite hard for me to see you all. In fact, I can't see you all. So please unmute yourselves and just speak, and then I will know. So at the moment, it feels like no one needs to say anything.
Gloria wants to speak.
Yeah,
Gloria,
mute. Unmute, Gloria. I can't see her, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, brilliant.
Thank you. These presentations were tremendous, very educational, and the information should be shared. I thank you all for having this forum and for letting me say something. I would like to say the elections will come. They may last a little bit depending on the struggle between the two parties and the ruling class. The movement will continue. People are ready. For our party, we're getting ready for the demonstrations that are bound to happen regardless. And pressure must be placed on whoever is the president to change all these reactionary policies, starting with Cuba and Venezuela as well. And I would say that for us, the biggest goal for us and objective must be education in the struggle, because the struggle is growing hugely in the United States, primarily on the issue of Black Lives Matter. The poverty, the millions who face eviction. I mean, huge, huge crisis. I'm sure in Britain you're experiencing the same too. But in that, when you talk about people facing evictions, we always say in Cuba, there are no evictions, and it opens people's eyes. But we must keep solidarity with Cuba. We must keep our internationalism strong. Thank you again. If people want to see live coverage from us the night of the election from our perspective on what's happening, you can link into liberationnews.org, and we're going to have news right as it goes, and live news on Breakthrough, at Breakthrough on Twitter. We have a great channel there that we're working into. Thank you
so much, and thank you for summing up there. Thank you to all our speakers. Just before, I think it would be lovely if we could all do at least a clapping hand. Before we do that, can we just have any announcements? Any announcements in the room?
Susie.
Yeah, announcement.
Cubanos in UK, we are going to start a campaign during November and December against the blockade. Unblock Cuba will be launching that next week, and we will send the link. And I hope you all guys join us on that. I guess this is a very important moment, and we have to keep the pressure.
Brilliant. And is there an announcement from Cassandra?
Yeah, hi. So on the 7th of November, on a Saturday, we will be supporting a protest that's being called by Pathfinder. It's called US Hands Off Cuba End British Complicity, and it will be from 12 p.m. till 2 p.m. in Tottenham, and I'm just going to post the details in the chat now. There's no link to a Facebook event, so just copy and paste the details so you remember, and that's Saturday 7th of November.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Cass. Any other announcements? You have to unmute yourselves.
Can I make another announcement? Sorry, am I past my quota? As well as the documentary, on Monday I'll be doing a seminar talk based on my book and how Cuba survived in the post-Soviet world for the University of Nottingham's Centre for Social Justice or something like that. So it's on my Facebook page if because I haven't got the link here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Helen. Check out the Facebook page. Sorry, you might have heard me. I just said, chuck me a paper. This is our newspaper, Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism. We have lots of news, including Cuba and the United States and coronavirus and the elections. And I know that it has been posted in the chat earlier, but get a copy. It is honestly brilliant, and we produce it for the people, produced by the people. There you go, a few other people holding up their issues. So we're going to now, if you want to stay on, we're going to show the last episode of Belly of the Beast, which is about the US blockade. And before we do that, I don't know if this is possible, but we can either clap or we could hold up thumbs or clapping hands to say thank you very much to Jose, the Cuban ambassador to the US, Gloria, presidential candidate, Party of Socialism and Liberation in the United States, Valia, Cuban physician and member of the Cubans in the UK, Helen Yaffe, Glasgow University and author of We Are Cuba, and Barbara, Cuban ambassador to Britain. Thank you so much for your time and contributions. So much. Thank you so much to everyone here. I've got lots of messages in the chat, and I will try and put people together because I can see people are wanting to stay in touch. Please do something now. Be active. Don't just be angry about it. Be active. Okay, I'm going to pass on to our tech people who are hopefully going to do something and let us watch this documentary. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Liz. The United States has 60 times more COVID deaths per capita than we do here in Cuba. No me sorprende.
Cuba has more doctors per person than any other country. We treat our doctors like war heroes, especially these days.
Estoy segura de que en Cuba vamos a estar bien. 100% confianza y seguridad de la medicina cubana.
Y nosotros confiamos en ellos.
Porque son los mejores médicos del mundo.
Since COVID began, every night at 9 p.m. we cheer for our doctors. Pero fuera de Cuba, todo no son aplausos.
In the last few years, our doctors have come under attack. Every morning, tens of thousands of doctors, nurses, and medical students take to the streets across Cuba. They are on the front lines of our fight against COVID. Talia Ruiz is a first-year medical student.
No me siento con miedo. Nosotros si nos cuidamos y tomamos las medidas necesarias tampoco tenemos por qué contagiarnos. Hay médicos que han ido y se han enfrentado directamente con la enfermedad y no se han contagiado, como por ejemplo mi papá. Hola, papá.
Talia's father, Juan Jesus, is a family doctor who works at a small clinic next to their home. In March, he joined a group of Cuban doctors on a medical mission to Lombardy, Italy. At the time, Lombardy was the global epicenter of the pandemic.
Por el número de casos. Desbordó los sistemas de salud. Ayudamos sobre todo a este personal médico que ya no podía ya con ese volumen de casos y salvamos unas cuantas vidas.
Gracias.
Caminar hacia el acto de despedida, en todas las casas la gente salía y nos aplaudía. Esa fue la sensación más agradable que he sentido en mi vida. Por esas cosas que uno sale de misión.
It wasn't the first time Juan Jesus risked his life far from home. He's part of the Henry Reeve Brigade, Cuba's Medical Special Forces.
Henry Reeve era un expedicionario norteamericano que vino a pelear en la guerra de 68 para Cuba contra los españoles. Se inauguró la brigada en el año 2005. Un huracán que se llamó Katrina, que acabó con Nueva Orleans, hubo una cantidad de muertos tremenda. Cuba se ofrece en mandar 100 médicos para trabajar conjuntamente con los médicos norteamericanos y ya estábamos listos.
George W. Bush rejected Cuba's offer to help New Orleans. Since then, Juan Jesus has treated survivors of natural disasters and epidemics around the world. In 2014, he fought Ebola in Liberia, West Africa.
Nos decía en la calle, ¿no? Ustedes están locos, se van a morir todos allá. La epidemia del ébola es una enfermedad muy letal y vamos asustados.
¿Por qué someterse a ese tipo de condiciones?
Por el afán de sentirse útil, sentir que salvaste una vida. Cada vez que pienso en que es probable que no me hayan pagado mucho, yo nada más que me acuerdo de las caras de las personas que se salvaron, ¿entiendes? Nosotros teníamos un niñito que se le murió la familia entera y nosotros éramos su único sustento. Usted sabe la alegría de verlo a él todos los días vivo. Eso es como si te pagaran mucho dinero.
Cuba's international medical program began in 1960 when it sent a health brigade to Chile in response to a deadly earthquake. Since then, Cuba has sent more than 400,000 medical personnel to 164 countries. For decades, Cuba's medical missions were purely humanitarian. The government didn't charge a penny. Today, Cuba still sends thousands of doctors to poor countries in Africa and Latin America at no cost. But in the last 20 years, Cuba has also begun charging wealthier countries. Under some of these deals, Cuban doctors receive about 25% of what the host governments pay. About 75% goes to the state. The money pays for free healthcare in Cuba. 30,000 Cuban healthcare workers now serve on missions in 59 countries. For years, US officials and Florida politicians have vilified Cuba's medical missions. Since Donald Trump was elected, they've intensified their attacks.
Okay, so the allegation is that Cuban doctors are being sent around the world to work in different places.
These Cuban medical missions, if you'll call them, are really just disguised human trafficking.
We've noticed how the regime in Havana has taken advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic to continue its exploitation of Cuban medical workers.
This business of forced labor is the functional equivalent of modern-day slavery.
USAID offered $3 million in grants to investigate alleged rights violations of Cuban medical personnel.
But the campaign against Cuba's international medical program had little impact until November 2018.
The breaking news is the far-right candidate Jair Bolsonaro has won Brazil's presidential race.
Dubbed the Donald Trump of the tropics.
With a history of making racist, misogynistic and homophobic comments.
He also talks up dictatorship. President Trump tweeted about it this morning. We agreed that Brazil and the United States will work closely together on trade and military and everything else.
Bolsonaro wasted no time in forcing an end to Cuba's medical program in Brazil.
Jamais faria acordo com Cuba nesses termos. Isso é trabalho escravo.
É difícil.
After Bolsonaro's comments, Cuba sent its doctors in Brazil home. It was a big blow to Cuba's health system, which lost hundreds of millions of dollars in annual income. Cuba's doctors were also affected.
In Cuba, you don't have to go far to see a doctor, porque en cada comunidad vive y trabaja uno.
Mario Diaz is a family doctor. 2 years ago, he was in Rio de Janeiro when Bolsonaro won the election.
Donde yo estaba, que era ciudad, nos recibieron muy bien por la diferencia del trato que da el médico brasileño al médico cubano. Los tratamos como personas, como un igual. No es una mercancía. No es que yo lo atiendo para coger dinero. Nosotros caímos en zonas que médicos brasileños no quieren ir a trabajar. Zonas de pobreza y lugares incluso que nunca tuvieron un médico.
¿Cuánto gana un médico trabajando en Cuba?
Tú tienes un salario básico, que es de 1.740 pesos. Allá ganaba $700. Es verdad que el gobierno de nosotros, con el sistema de salud, se quedaba con una parte de ese contrato. Pagaba por cada médico cubano 12.000 reales, nosotros recibíamos alrededor de 3.000. Pero lo invierte aquí en obras sociales, la reparación de las instituciones de salud, la compra de materia prima para producir medicamentos en nuestro país. No es que se lo coge el presidente. Tú lo miras desde el punto de vista personal, a lo mejor lo ves como injusto, pero tú piensas en algo más grande y ves que tiene un beneficio para el país. Hay un dicho aquí en Cuba que nosotros usamos que es que el ladrón piensa que todo el mundo es de su misma condición. Ellos piensan que todo el mundo gira alrededor del dinero nada más. Y no es así. Yo quise ser médico siempre. ¿Para qué? Para ayudar a la gente. Eso no es porque voy a ser rico. De hecho, yo vivo aquí mismo donde trabajo. Yo me encuentro con mis vecinos en la cola de la tienda.
¿Dónde entra Estados Unidos en todo esto?
Bolsonaro siempre siguió la línea del presidente americano. A él le dicen el Trump latino. Estados Unidos quieren cortar esa entrada para ahogar la economía cubana, para tratar de lograr un cambio político aquí en la isla, ¿entiendes? Cuando Cuba se retiró del programa, alrededor de 1.700 municipios quedaron de un golpe sin médico. Así. Yo tuve la experiencia de un paciente mío allá en Brasil, un señor de alrededor de 70 años, analfabeto. Y él marcó con su tapa para ir a despedirse de mí. Y lloró aquí en el hombro mío.
Millions of Brazilians in poor communities were left without health care. It was just the beginning. Ecuador's president became a Trump ally, and then, in November 2019, he expelled hundreds of Cuban doctors. That same month, a US-supported coup ousted Bolivian President Evo Morales. Bolivia's de facto government immediately took aim at the Cuban doctors.
Los falsos médicos cubanos.
Nos acusaba de que no éramos médicos, nos acusaba de bandidos.
Joandra Muro was head of the Cuban Medical Mission in Bolivia.
Amenazaban con quemar la casa de los médicos cubanos, a otros los llevaban a la Interpol, a 2 de nuestros compañeros los apuntaron con armas, revisaron a nuestras mujeres, algunas las desnudaron.
Cuando sucedió lo de Brasil, el argumento era de que los médicos cubanos eran víctimas, hay los pobres médicos cubanos que son esclavos del gobierno de Cuba. Sin embargo, el discurso respecto a Bolivia cambió. Ya no eran víctimas, sino que eran victimarios.
Siempre van a buscar algún argumento para llegar al mismo fin, que es desacreditar. En Bolivia no podían hablar del dinero que Cuba recibía. En Bolivia cada colaborador recibía un estipendio de $800, pero era un pago directo al colaborador. A Cuba no le pagaba.
¿Qué usted cree que está detrás de todo esto?
Ya había una comunicación del propio gobierno de los Estados Unidos de una agresión abierta y además financiada para atacar la colaboración médica cubana. El carro que estaba allí frente a nuestras casas era un carro de la Embajada Americana. ¿Qué hace un carro de la Embajada de los Estados Unidos en el momento que nos están deteniendo a nosotros como médicos cubanos?
After Joandra returned to Havana, she became the head of ELAM, the biggest medical school in the world.
La Escuela Latinoamericana de Medicina es una escuela totalmente gratuita. Hemos graduado más de 30.000 jóvenes de 117 países y ya tenemos 198 graduados de los Estados Unidos. El mundo necesita médicos, que no fuera solo mandando ayuda, mandando colaboración médica, que qué importante sería que esos países tuvieran su propia formación de médicos. Esto es nuestro aporte en un mundo tan desigual y en un mundo que hoy quizás no te brinda la posibilidad desde el propio lugar donde vives de formarte como médico.
In the face of the global pandemic, Cuba's international medical program has grown. The Henry Reeve Brigade has sent nearly 4,000 doctors and nurses to more than 30 countries to fight COVID. But the Cubans were still not welcome in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Brazil.
In Bolivia, the healthcare system there has been overwhelmed by the coronavirus pandemic.
Hospitals are at breaking point. People aren't just dying in their cars, they're also dying on the street.
Ecuador is seeing one of the world's worst coronavirus outbreaks.
Corpses wrapped in plastic and left on the sidewalk in Ecuador.
Brazil's infections are rocketing, particularly among the poor.
They're digging thousands upon thousands of graves.
Brazil now has the second highest number of cases and deaths in the world.
Even with so many doctors fighting COVID in other countries, Cuba has contained the pandemic at home.
Yo atiendo en esta zona 952 pacientes y no he tenido caso de COVID. El punto fundamental de que el COVID no haya sido una epidemia inmensa en Cuba ha sido la pesquisa y el aislamiento de contacto. Mi hija pesquisando, la pobrecita, subir y bajar escaleras no es nada grave, pero es lo que le toca.
¿Qué edad tú tenías cuando tu papá se fue a la primera misión?
Cuando yo tenía 1 año ya estaba cumpliendo una misión. Es tu papá y quieres tenerlo aquí y sabes como que sientes que te falta algo. Con el pasar de los años vas entendiendo la situación, que ese es su propósito en esta vida. No es un médico simplemente cubano, es un médico del mundo. Mi sueño es ser un médico tan abnegado y sacrificado como lo es mi papá. Hay muchas campañas difamatorias, sobre todo de parte de los Estados Unidos, pero al final todo es mentira. Son gente con un corazón inmenso que aman lo que están haciendo.
¿Usted ha notado un cambio entre las actitudes del gobierno de los Estados Unidos con los médicos cubanos en los últimos años?
Hay una mayor hostilidad respecto a las misiones médicas cubanas.
¿Por qué están haciendo eso?
Fácil, es parte del bloqueo. La Henry Reed es muy altruista, hace las misiones para servir a los demás, pero hay misiones que si eran remuneradas, que Cuba recibía dinero de esas misiones. Ese es el objetivo fundamental del decreto de los médicos cubanos. No porque le interese la cantidad de horas que trabajé, sencillamente para privar al país de otra fuente más de dinero.
¿Acaso el gobierno de los Estados Unidos no tiene suficientes problemas que resolver para andar preocupándose por nosotros?
Some people say the blockade isn't a big deal, that our economic problems are only caused by our government or by socialism.
If that's true, ¿por qué no quitan el bloqueo?
Chapters of Belly of the Beast, do look out for them. I do believe they were posted earlier in the chat, but it's absolutely excellent. Just to say that Sam has got a couple more announcements that we missed that came in during that, and that she'll put into the chat. And I was sent a link to the Cuba Support Island hashtag Walking for Cuba. Please check out their social media. There was also a lovely message from the British branch of the Partido Comunista Italy to all the participants in the meeting, and especially to the RCG members and the representatives of the Cuban Republic. Thank you for all the support given by the Henry Reeve Brigade to the people of Italy during the COVID-19 pandemic this year. That's from Elaine Bissell, Party Comunista British branch. So a couple of other announcements coming up. We could leave the chat open maybe for a few minutes so people can get those links. I think there was still 100 people in the room a minute ago. So It's been brilliant having you here. I really hope that you've all made links with someone, reached out to someone. If you haven't, you can always reach out to me. I think I'm available, but you can send me a personal message if you want to. And you know, we want to make sure we all stay in touch. There's a lot of work to do, and it's been brilliant having you all here. Is there anything else?
Susie, can I just say one more thing? Sorry. Valia mentioned that the Henry Rave International Medical Contingents have been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. The importance of the nomination is not the prize and whether they receive it. It's that we share information about the incredible contribution that they've been making around the world. And there's a lot of talk about coming out of the pandemic, you know, with a different concept of international relations, cooperation, solidarity. Well, actually, no one shows that better than the Henry Reeve Brigades. So I think someone has some links to two things. One is there's an organisation, activist organisation, anti-imperialist organisation in the United States called Code Pink, and they have a petition which you can sign, but you might also find, like I did, that you are able to nominate personally. I could do that because I'm an academic. So Ruby, if you've got those links, can you post those in the chat so you can have a look at the application form, see if you fit any of the criteria and make a nomination yourself. Otherwise, sign one of the petitions. There are organisations all around the world who have petitions calling for the Henry Reeve International Medical Contingent to be recognised for its contribution during the pandemic.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, everyone. I feel like you're all still here and we should do something more, but we can't. Okay, so thank you so much for coming. Keep in touch. Let's give everyone a big clap. And maybe we could put some music on, Jacob, then people can just copy the chat. Will has said how we can copy the chat. If you're still chatting to someone in the room, complete your chatting, and yeah, let's all stay in touch. Viva Cuba! Viva Cuba Socialismo! Viva Fidel! Viva Bolivia and the mass movement! Viva Venezuela! And Lenin, there's a chap earlier called Lenin who said, how are we going to get the gold back? Well, we'll do another protest outside the Bank of England for you. Okay, thank you, everyone. Take care.